Love those happy bubbles. Hi, and welcome to Something to Talk About. I'm Linda McNamee, and as you saw from our introduction, for the next hour we will be talking about conservation and the environment. And you will meet my wonderful guest, whom you will meet momentarily. But before I begin, as you know, I always like to start with a little housekeeping. Um, if you are interested in calling and talking to our wonderful guest, you are more than welcome to call this evening. 781-270-9199 if you have a question. If you think of something after the fact and we are no longer live, you can, or if you have a suggestion for a future topic, you can always email me at talk@bcattv.org. As always, I would like to thank the crew for this evening. We have John Vias and Chris Flaherty, who are staff members here, making sure that us volunteers behave ourselves and kind of get everything done what we're supposed to do. And I would like to thank Evan McNamee, who is a volunteer, giving up his Wednesday evening to come and hang out at BCAT. And last but definitely not least, I would like to thank my husband Paul for staying home for Daddy Date Night, even though half of the Daddy Date Night is here as crew. So thank you, everyone. And now I would like you to meet my wonderful guest, John Keeley, who is the Conservation Administrator for the town of Burlington. So thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
I can't wait to find all about how your area is related to the environment and what we can do and what the town's doing. And oh, can't wait. So thank you. But before we delve into the Conservation Department and Conservation Commission, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, how you came to the Burlington area, and what interested you in working in the conservation field?
Sure. So I was born in Connecticut, and I grew up mostly in southern New Hampshire. I've lived in Massachusetts for over 40 years, though. I got a degree, an undergraduate degree, from the University of Notre Dame in English. But it started out as a biology major, and that was sort of my true love. But I didn't do too well in school when I was studying biology and chemistry and calculus and whatnot. So I switched majors, and
those are tough subjects. I get that.
So I kicked myself for years for not sticking with it and trying a little harder. So several years later, after doing a variety of jobs, I decided to go back to graduate school, and I went to UMass Lowell and got a master's degree in environmental studies.
Oh, cool.
And while I was taking that course, that program, I took a course in wetland ecology. And that really interested me, and I realized I was very interested in conservation and wetlands. So shortly after I got that master's degree, I got a summer job in Burlington back in, it was either 93 or 94, doing stream cleaning, supervising the stream cleaning program. And then eventually, a year or two later, I got a job as a conservation agent in a town on the South Shore.
Okay.
After that, I got a job in Wilmington doing that, same sort of work. And then I came to Burlington in 2002 as the conservation administrator.
I came to Burlington in 2002 too.
Wow.
Cool. Great year.
It was.
So what is the difference between the Conservation Department and the Conservation Commission?
Yeah. Okay, so.
Or are they interchangeable?
Well, no, they're not interchangeable. So every city and town in Massachusetts, 351 cities and towns, have conservation commissions.
Okay.
And by statute, they're a volunteer board. So in no city or town are they elected. They're all appointed and unpaid. So in most cities and towns, they're a seven-member board. In some towns, they may only have 5 conservation commissioners, but in most, there's 7. Now, in the larger cities and towns, and almost all of eastern Massachusetts, because of the amount of development that goes on, there are conservation departments, which basically help administer, advise the Conservation Commission, and because the workload is simply too much for a volunteer board.
Oh, yeah.
It may work in someplace in the Berkshires or something, but in eastern Mass and even in central Mass, where there's a lot of construction, volunteers just can't handle that kind of work. So
okay.
so the conservation department is a professional department in the town. In Burlington, we have myself, my assistant conservation administrator, Eileen Coleman, and we have an administrative assistant, Lisa Crow, and we also have a recording clerk who records our minutes at the meeting.
Okay. So that's a pretty small department, it seems, for doing a lot of work.
Yeah, and the work, it's actually, the work has probably increased quite a bit in the last few years too, because we've taken on added responsibilities. When I first came here, basically the conservation department was just permitting, and the conservation commission and department were just permitting projects near wetlands.
Okay.
Subsequent to that, the EPA passed rules about stormwater runoff, and so the town had to pass a stormwater bylaw.
Okay.
And now conservation is responsible for that as well. So, yeah, there's a lot going on that the conservation department's involved in.
So with all the development, is it just like residential development? Is it business development, a combination of both? And how exactly are you involved in that development?
Okay, so it's definitely both. So for residential development, most of the residential development these days is tearing down houses and building new houses.
Well, yeah, because we don't have any land left. You have to use
exactly.
what you know.
There is some. I mean, there's some new development, but the overwhelming majority of it is tear down. So we
Okay.
get involved to make sure, if it's near wetlands, obviously, to make sure the wetlands are protected.
Okay.
And irregardless of whether there's wetlands, we make sure that the stormwater is handled correctly. So, you know,
Okay.
they're not discharging dirty water, and they're not discharging water onto their neighbors' properties or out into the road and all that. Commercial projects is basically the same thing on a much, much bigger scale. You know, so the commercial projects are far more complex. The amount of engineering involved that we have to review is much greater, just because of the size of the projects and the amount of mitigation that they have to do. Instead of, you know, just a roof and a driveway, you're dealing with, you know, giant parking lots and whatnot.
And when you're talking about like runoff and stormwater, is it like all topographical, like just angles of land, or are there other factors that need to be considered?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors. So what we try to do is promote infiltration of stormwater into the ground, so that instead of having it just run off, that it actually goes into the ground.
Oh, okay.
But to do that, they have to have the soil evaluated by a professional to determine whether or not the soil is suitable to infiltrate, and how
Okay.
deep it is to ledge, you know, or if there's contamination issues that may preclude infiltration, because you don't want to affect some underground plume.
Okay.
So yeah, there's a host of things for a commercial project to figure in, and that's why all those commercial projects have you know, professional engineers with pages and pages of runoff calculations that they submit to us,
Wow.
and all kinds of documentation.
Oh, wow.
It's much simpler for a residential project, but it's the same thing, just on a much smaller scale.
Okay. And I had another question, and it totally, so I'm just going to stick with this over here. Yeah, that was it. You mentioned wetlands, and originally, or historically, the Conservation Department and Conservation Commission focused more on properties abutting wetlands. How much of Burlington is actually considered wetlands? Is there a lot of it, like percentage-wise, or is that still as big of an issue with just tear down and
Oh no, it's still,
rebuild, or?
yeah, it's still a huge issue. I would just estimate maybe 15–20% as a rough guess at you know, how much of the town is wetlands.
Okay. What's the difference between wetlands and conservation land?
Okay. So conservation land, officially conservation land, is town-owned land that is managed for conservation purposes.
Okay.
So our conservation areas, for instance, the Mill Pond Conservation Area, or the Sawmill Brook Conservation Area. So those are open spaces the town owns and the Conservation Department manages. And several of those have trails and trail maps and whatnot.
Okay.
Frequently people call wetlands conservation land, and it's usually, when they're usually referring to privately owned land that is
okay.
wetlands.
Okay.
It has restrictions on it under state law, under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act.
Okay.
So in one sense, it is sort of being conserved, but it's sort of confusing to call it conservation land because what we call conservation land is the land that we manage,
Okay.
not the land necessarily
So like the
that we regulate.
wetlands, you just can't build on it necessarily. So
It's very
people
difficult,
just
yeah.
assume it's being
Right.
saved for
Yeah. I mean,
conservation
frequently
purposes.
people tell us, oh, when we bought this house, they told us that was conservation land behind us. And it, you know, it was probably misidentified. You know, it may have been wetlands, but not town-owned conservation land.
Now, I've also heard the term like floodplains. What exactly is a floodplain?
Okay.
And how is that related to wetlands? Or
Okay.
are they related?
Oh yeah, they're very definitely related. So I mean, there's different types of floodplain, but in Massachusetts, under the Wetlands Protection Act, we regulate what's called the 100-year floodplain, which is the area that in any given year has a 1% chance of having a fairly severe flood of at least a foot of water.
Okay.
And that area is actually mapped and delineated by a federal agency, FEMA.
Okay.
FEMA puts out maps that show where the 100-year floodplain is. And there's all kinds of restrictions on what can be done in the floodplain, both under state building codes, which we're not involved in, but they do regulate construction in the floodplain. And Conservation Commission regulates it under the Wetlands Protection Act and the local wetland bylaw.
Okay.
So for instance, if you're in a floodplain and you wanted to build a new house, you would probably at this point have to build it on, and it was a brand new house in a floodplain, you'd probably have to build it on some sort of piers or something. You couldn't just put in a foundation because you'd be essentially considered filling floodplain.
Oh, and you're not allowed to do that.
Right.
Oh.
So obviously a lot of floodplains are wetlands, but there's
Okay.
a lot of floodplain that's not wetlands. There are many people in town who are paying flood insurance because their houses are in the floodplain. They're not in a wetland per se, but they're in a floodplain. And
okay.
flood insurance is very expensive and probably getting more expensive all the time, I would imagine.
And we went through a few years ago in Burlington that I think we actually hit like that 1% where everybody seemed to be getting flooded. I don't know if you remember that or how that affected you. But I do remember when we were looking for houses, it was like, oh, no, this isn't a floodplain. We're going to go somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, so, I mean, because of climate change, the intensity of rainstorms is getting much, much greater. They used to say that the 100-year flood was like about 6.5 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. Now they're estimating it's close to 9 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. So they're saying that these storms, which would happen, I mean, they call it the 100-year flood. It doesn't mean it happens once every 100 years. It just means that there's a 1% chance each year.
Okay.
But they're saying now, instead of 6.5 inches of rain, it's closer to like 9 inches of rain. So consequently, the mapping of the floodplains is going to be changing. And there are people who may not be in the floodplain today, but then when FEMA comes out with new maps down the road, they may find that they're in a newly configured floodplain.
How often do they redo those maps? Whenever necessary, or is it like a 10-year thing like the census is? Or?
Yeah, it's not regular. Most of Burlington is still operating on floodplains that were mapped in 1984.
Oh, okay.
But I know they are preparing new ones, and I suspect with the climate change the way it is, they may be doing them more frequently.
Okay. Now, with the new construction, would it be possible, or how would the new construction, could that change a floodplain? Like depending on the kind of house you built, you know, could you be disturbing groundwater and then
So groundwater's different.
Oh, okay.
Yep, groundwater, so the floodplain is water on the surface, so
Okay.
the ground, theoretically, no construction should impact the floodplain at all.
Oh, okay.
Partly because we make sure the construction is done right.
Well, yeah, that would help.
But but the amount of water in a river in the floodplain is so great that any one construction project wouldn't have any sort of significant impact
Okay.
anyway.
So now that I brought it up, what is groundwater?
Okay. Yeah.
Is
so
that
so,
what
so
we drink? You
yeah.
know,
So that's the
okay.
water table under the ground,
Okay.
which the Conservation Commission and the Wetlands Protection Act does not regulate groundwater. So
Okay.
it's
Can it be regulated? Or is
so
it just kind of
well,
there?
there's things that you can regulate. Actually,
okay.
the planning board actually has a proposed zoning article that they're
Oh.
bringing to May town meeting, which would require the foundation of a new house to be 2 feet above the water table,
Okay.
so that people don't have cellars built into the water table, which means they'll get water in their basement.
Yeah.
So if you're buying a brand new house, you probably don't want a sump pump in a brand new house that you just bought.
No.
You shouldn't need one in a brand new house. So
Okay.
that's one thing that the town is proposing to do. But the Conservation Commission has no role actually in regulating groundwater.
Okay. That's interesting. Okay. Now, what was you said that the proposed regulation would be 2 feet above the table. Is there a regulation now, or is it just
No.
up to the builders?
No, it is up to the builder. And actually, the idea came to us because there were several builders that we talked to who were surprised that we didn't have a bylaw like that, because most of the towns around us do.
Oh, okay.
So we checked, and Billerica does, Wilmington does, Lexington does.
Okay.
It's just a good idea, not to put your cellar in the water table.
Gee, what a concept.
Right.
So back to floodplains.
Yep.
How do floodplains affect property values? You mentioned that there is the added expense of insurance, which can be very high.
Right.
Does it, because people are buying houses left and right, knocking them down, putting up new houses, with the floodplains, or depending on the water table, how does that impact the property value? Does it? Does it?
I would imagine it does. I'm not an expert in that, but it's very difficult. It would be very difficult to tear down a house in the floodplain and build a new house.
Okay.
It'd be much, much more difficult to do than a house that wasn't in the floodplain.
Okay.
So I would imagine that would impact the value of the house. We've seen houses that are in the floodplain. The Conservation Commission has seen projects for houses in the floodplain that have built additions, and the additions have had to basically have no foundation and either have piers or some sort of, to let the water just go under the addition.
Okay.
So, but how that impacts
that
the value of the
impacts
house, I'm not really
okay.
sure.
Have to talk to a realtor for that.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. On the website, you had some frequently asked questions, or FAQ section. There are questions about tree removal.
Okay.
So when and why would somebody have to talk to either the commission or the department about getting trees taken down?
Okay. So the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act and also the Burlington Wetland Bylaw regulate any sort of activity within 100 feet of wetlands that basically would be viewed as potentially altering the wetlands. So that would mean any construction, any grading, any clearing, any removal of vegetation. So if it's within 100 feet of a wetlands,
Okay.
the Conservation Commission, or if it's something minor, the Conservation Commission staff can approve it.
Okay.
So typically, the Conservation Commission gives the authority to staff, the Conservation Department, for limited tree cutting,
Okay.
Removal of dangerous trees, unhealthy trees, and that sort of thing. But if somebody wanted to cut down, say, 10 perfectly healthy trees within 100 feet of a wetland, they would have to go before the full Conservation Commission and get approval.
Okay. Because I know like a lot of people are wanting to go solar, and because of that, they're getting tree removal. So it's really, if I am understanding you correctly, it's really only if they're close to the wetlands themselves, but not everybody necessarily needs.
You're
to get
correct. But
approval.
I mean, there's definitely, among the Conservation Commission, there's definitely some sentiment for maybe at some point pursuing a tree bylaw.
Okay.
But we don't have anything like that now, so it's just.
What would the tree bylaw involve? Like, take one down, plant a new one, or?
Probably something like that. I
Okay.
mean, that's generally what they do when it's within 100 feet of wetlands. They try to try to have at least 1-to-1 replacement. And obviously, you know, if you're replacing a 60-foot tree with like a 6-foot tree, it's going to be a while before it's a true replacement. But I mean.
But it's a start.
Exactly.
You know, in
Yeah,
another 60, 100 years, then you can reevaluate.
Right. Somebody will be able to anyway. Won't be us, but.
Well, you never know. You also mentioned vegetation. What other types of vegetation are we talking about?
So basically anything. So if somebody has an area near a wetland that's all native shrubs,
Okay.
and they want to clear it out, they need to check with the Conservation
Okay.
Department.
Now, is this because of erosion purposes?
No, it's
No?
basically any alteration within 100 feet of wetlands, we've got to basically evaluate the impact to the
Okay.
wetland. So vegetated buffers to wetlands are really important for water quality. Vegetated areas slow down water runoff. They help
Okay.
clean runoff. So the more of a vegetated buffer you have between any activity and a
Okay.
wetland, and by activity it could just be a lawn.
Okay.
Somebody's got a lawn and they're putting down fertilizers on their lawn, and you know
Okay. The
that
runoff.
stuff tends to run off towards a wetland. So if you've got if you have a fairly sizable buffer of naturally vegetated area, a lot of that nutrient from the fertilizers will be taken up in the buffer and won't actually make its way into the wetland.
Okay.
So, you know, some people just think, oh, it's just a scrubby area. Well, you know, it has a lot of benefit for water quality, and it also has benefit for other things like wildlife habitat.
It's there for a purpose.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah. But if it's, you know, invasive species, or if it's, like I said before, dangerous trees or something
Okay.
like that, it's fairly easy to remove. The closer to the wetlands, the more likely the Commission's going to say, leave it there. Like the Commission has a 20-foot no disturb setback to wetlands,
Oh, okay.
so they like that to be totally naturally vegetated.
Okay. Speaking of water quality, can we talk a little bit more about water quality in Burlington?
Okay?
There's been a lot of discussion about water quality. So currently, right now, we have Mill Pond. Is Vinebrook still, what's the deal?
I think they're still using that.
Okay. And how, I'm not even sure what I want to ask, but I know that there's been a lot of issues with forever chemicals in the water, and just boil water ores and filtration systems. How is the environment able to protect, if they are, some of these water issues that Burlington's been experiencing lately? Or what can we as residents do to fix?
Right,
the
so
direction
some
we're
of
going?
those things, like the PFAS, you know, a vegetated buffer to the wetland isn't really going to help. I mean, once that stuff gets into the water, it's going to travel as groundwater.
Okay.
And there's nothing like that, as from a conservation perspective, you're going to be able to do about it once that
Okay.
stuff gets in the water.
Because it's forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think the water department and the DPW have plans, you know, to filter it out through a
Okay.
water treatment plant, but there's nothing you can do as far as like land use at this point, you know,
Okay.
protecting the wetlands or whatnot. It's, you know, it's not effective for removing something like that. So regulating stormwater, a lot of the stuff we're trying to remove from the stormwater is stuff that's fairly easily removed from
Okay.
water. Nutrients and metals and whatnot, heavy
Okay.
metals,
Like
which can
the
be taken up by plants
Oh, okay.
and can be
But like the
absorbed into
fertilizers
the
and-
ground. Yeah, fertilizers.
Oh, okay.
But you know, an industrial chemical like that, you need a water treatment plant to remove it.
Do you have any suggestions or alternatives that homeowners can use to, you know, instead of using these fertilizers? Are there other options?
Yeah, so there's certainly organic fertilizers, slow release fertilizers, putting them on very judiciously and not putting them on too heavily. I mean,
Okay.
one of the largest problems is people put on too much, and then it rains and it washes down your driveway and into a catch basin and then
Okay.
right into a stream.
Okay.
So, you know, definitely be judicious and follow all the instructions on, you know, when to apply it.
Okay. So I think we kind of, you know, how much interaction, you know, you were mentioning the surrounding towns. How much interaction does the Conservation Commission or Conservation Department work with the surrounding towns? Because like groundwater just doesn't know property lines.
So it's kind of funny. We are in very close touch with colleagues in other towns, but not necessarily contiguous or neighboring towns. You know, we're members of professional organizations like the Mass Society of Municipal Conservation Professionals, which is a group of obviously conservation professionals from mostly Eastern Mass, although
Okay.
it's statewide. So we get together frequently, more than once a month usually, nowadays by Zoom or whatever.
Everything's virtual now.
Yeah. So, I mean, we all, there's a lot of educating each other about issues that are happening in other towns and how to deal with it and whatnot. But I have surprisingly little contact actually with the conservation departments in adjacent towns.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of those things about Massachusetts where each city and town is pretty much on its own, and we're our own little kingdoms, and yeah, we don't have that much to do with the other communities nearby. Every now and then there may be an issue right on the border or something like that, but generally not that much.
What role does your department play in like wildlife protection or wildlife, anything to deal with wildlife?
Yeah, I mean, not as much as I wish we did. So our jurisdiction is really only to protect endangered species. And there's no endangered species habitat in Burlington.
Okay.
There's some limited habitat actually for endangered plants, but there's no endangered wildlife. I take that back. There is one fish that's listed on the as not endangered, but I think it's special concern.
Okay.
That's in Vine Brook. But I mean, I think a lot of people sort of mistakenly think that the Conservation Commission is protecting the habitat for deer. I mean, sometimes people come in, complaining about a project and say, well, there's deer and there's coyotes. There's nothing.
Coyotes, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, some people want to protect the coyotes, and that's fine, but we don't have any authority in any way. The best we can do is protect as much open space as we can.
Okay.
Certainly the conservation areas, but
because I know we have, in my area of Burlington, we have just about every animal wandering through.
yeah, it's amazing the wildlife that is in Burlington. People don't realize that there were two. Well, people probably remember the Burlington Bear.
Yes, I was just thinking of him. or
Yeah.
her.
The following spring, I guess that was it 3 years ago, I guess, maybe? The bear came out of hibernation and tore apart some beehives up at Northwest Park. near the old Sun Microsystem
Okay.
campus. They had a wildflower garden there, and they had some beekeepers from the North Shore. Beverly Bees had beehives there,
Okay.
and the bear came out of hibernation and just tore the beehives
no.
apart. But you know, I've seen pictures of bobcats, and I saw a fisher at Mill Pond Conservation Area a
Okay.
few weeks ago, and so yeah, it's
And
pretty
my
amazing.
husband actually caught a fisher on our trail cam
Yeah,
in our backyard.
yeah, yeah. So there's an amazing amount of wildlife, and you know, they just managed to. There's enough open space, even between the open spaces. There's enough backyards or power lines or whatnot for them
Okay.
to get around and get from one area to another.
You know, I'm just thinking back to the topic of tonight's show was, you know, conservation and the environment. And the environment is kind of like all-inclusive, covers a lot of different areas. You know, we talked about water, groundwater, we talked about floodplains. What other, you know, we did just mention wildlife, where that really doesn't fall under your jurisdiction. But how else is you meaning your area involved in protecting our environment?
Okay, so one thing I should mention is we received a state grant under the MVP program, which is the Municipal Vulnerability Program. I think the P is program, something like
It's
that.
hard to say, whatever.
So we are actually doing a project where we're evaluating the effects of climate change on a large area of Burlington, the Vinebrook Watershed area.
Oh, okay.
So Vinebrook Watershed is it's probably more than half the town. Burlington's
Oh, wow.
in 3 watersheds. It's in the Vinebrook Watershed, which is part of the Shawshene River Watershed, which is ultimately part of the Merrimack River Watershed. Then we're in the Ipswich River Watershed, the northern portion of town, and the eastern portion of town is in the Mystic River Watershed. But so our study is on the Vinebrook Watershed, and we're evaluating the effects of climate change on flooding and on heat island effects.
Ooh, what's heat island?
So
effect?
heat island is basically the more pavement you have, you create these little microclimates of elevated temperatures. Just like, you know, in Boston, the nighttime temperature may be 10 degrees warmer than it is in Burlington, and
Because of all the pavement.
because of the pavement, yeah. And so Burlington has little areas of that as well, and a lot of it's in the Vinebrook Watershed because that area all along Middlesex Turnpike has so much impervious area.
Right, okay.
And it's also subject to a lot of flooding because Vinebrook and its tributaries are very flood prone.
Okay.
And like I said before, the rainfall events are getting greater and greater, with
Right.
greater intensity. So we're doing a study on that. We have an environmental consultant, BSC group, doing the work, and so we're hoping to, you know, we'll get a report, and actually in the report there'll be some recommendations on things we can do to mitigate the effects, both the heat island effect and flooding effect.
Okay. What is the timeline scope of?
So the
This
report will be
project.
done by the end of June.
Oh, okay. So that's
Yeah.
pretty quick.
Yeah. We've been doing it for like 6 months probably.
Okay.
Yeah. Other environmental things.
Actually, can we back up for a second?
Oh, sure.
What's a watershed?
Okay.
I've seen signs, you know, entering this watershed or, you know, protect this watershed.
Yeah. Okay. So
I know it seems really basic, but.
yeah. So it's basically all topography. So the area of land that drains towards a river. So so just envision like 2 mountain ranges with a river in the middle. So, you know, the water comes down off the mountains and goes towards the river in the middle.
Okay.
So, I mean, obviously we don't have mountains, but we've got topography.
Okay.
So there's certain areas of town where, you know, if rain falls in the ground, it's going to
Where's
go
it
into
gonna
the
go?
Vinebrook.
Oh,
In another area, if it falls, it may go into Sawmill Brook, which runs
Okay.
into the Ipswich River eventually.
okay.
So it's all
And
where
Vinebrook,
the
you said
water.
Merrimack?
So yeah, Vinebrook flows out of Burlington into Bedford, where it joins the Shawshene River,
Shawshene,
and then the Shawshene River flows up and joins the Merrimack in Lawrence.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So a raindrop that falls in the Burlington Mall eventually goes into the ocean in Newburyport, where the Merrimack River discharges.
Cool.
Yeah, so a drop of rain that falls in over near
Market Basket? Or would that still be?
okay, Market Basket. Yeah, perfect example. Would actually go into flow towards the Aberjona River, which flows into the Mystic River, and would end up in Boston Harbor. So it's kind of amazing. 2 raindrops in 2 different parts of town. One ends up in Boston Harbor, the other one up in Newburyport at the Merrimack River.
That's pretty
So
cool.
that's watersheds. It's all it's where it
okay.
where it lands and what river it flows
And we're
to.
in 3 different, Burlington is,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, and each one's really different. So the portion of Burlington that's in the Ipswich River is highly residential. So there's very little commercial. Whereas the Shawshene River watershed is
Mixed?
the Vinebrook it's heavily developed, and that's why why we're doing that
Okay,
that study. And the Mystic is the Mystic is a little more mixed.
okay.
Yeah.
Now, over by Vinebrook, there's a lot of nature trails. Is any of that conservation area? Or what would you call that area of land where the water treatment is, and over by Francis Wyman's school, they have like some trails back
Yeah.
there?
So that is all under the water department. So that's
Okay.
all watershed protection land. The town
Okay.
has wells back in there. You can actually see a well from right across from the school. If you look, there's a driveway that goes down to a well
Oh,
down there.
okay.
So, but eventually, in the not too distant future, the town won't be using those wells.
Okay.
But I think the intention, certainly I hope, is to keep all that land as open space.
Okay.
I mean, some of it, the town, where the water treatment plant is, the town may have other municipal uses, but hopefully it'll stay municipal land.
Now, why would we stop using the wells? Because the wells dry up, or is it just
No,
not
so
economically?
So those
Feasible.
wells they're being replaced by the MWRA water because of
Oh, okay.
the contamination issues, and
Okay.
it was just deemed more, I guess, financially
Cost-effective.
feasible to bring in MWRA than try to do another, upgrade to that treatment plant.
Oh.
So they're
okay.
upgrading the treatment plant at Mill Pond.
Okay.
I think they're going to start construction within a month or 2.
Okay.
But so the Mill Pond treatment plant is just for the Mill Pond reservoir, and then
Okay.
the treatment.
And we actually use that as a reservoir.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. If that's an amazing story too. If you
Oh,
ever
yeah,
walk
let's hear the
around there,
Yes.
there's a pipe at the end closest to if you come into the reservoir from Hanson and McKechnie, there's a pipe, big pipe there, and if you go there at certain times, there's water pouring out of that pipe into the reservoir. And that's not like storm water running off from somewhere. The town actually pumps water from the Shawshene River, and it travels underground, I'm not really sure, 2 or 3 miles, and into the reservoir. So there's
Wild.
there's an intake somewhere over near the Shawshene Tech,
Okay.
and the town is permitted to pull water out of there during high flow periods
Okay.
and put it in the reservoir.
Because we've done some walks around the reservoir, and the water levels, the changes,
Yeah.
really change what the reservoir looks like.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, when it's really low, you probably not, most of the time if it's really low, you're not going to see them pumping into it, because that means the river's probably really low. So in periods of drought, the reservoir can get really low, and they can't really start pumping back into it until the Shawshene River reaches a certain
Yeah.
elevation.
Because
Yeah.
there's no water to pump.
Yeah. So the mill pond is actually surrounded by our biggest conservation area, the Mill Pond Conservation Area.
Okay.
So if you're walking around Mill Pond, you're on the water department land. So the water department, controls the reservoir and the land around it. So if you walk around it, you're most of the time, if not all the time, not on conservation land. But there are trails that go off in various directions off
Okay.
that, and those are our conservation areas around
Oh,
there.
okay.
So, but that's our largest and probably our most popular conservation area.
How do you know when you're crossing from one to the other? Do you?
You wouldn't know.
You wouldn't
no.
know. You
Yeah.
just kind of show up.
Yeah, it's all protected open space as far as most people, it doesn't really matter to most people whether you're on the water department land or the conservation land.
Okay. Now I just remember like walking around there too. It's also really cool. Well, some of the fences probably need some work, but you see signs that have like grown into the trees
Yeah.
and everything. It's a really nice area though.
It is, it's very nice.
Needs a little more parking, but then we go to the issue of more parking means more of the, what was it, island?
Heat island? Heat
Island
island
thing.
effect.
The
Right.
island effect.
Right, and also, it is a town drinking water supply, so you don't want to overuse the area.
Right.
The more people, the more dogs, and run off into the reservoir, and that just makes it harder for the treatment plant, I would imagine.
Now, sometimes fishing is allowed in the reservoir.
I believe the recreation department handles that. I think you get a license through the rec department.
Right,
And I
but I'm
think they
just
actually stock it.
That's what was going to be my question is,
Yeah.
do they stock it or
I'm
does
pretty
it
sure they
just,
do,
like-
yeah. I know they have in the past. I presume they still do,
Okay,
yeah. And then they issue licenses, and they have tournaments, I think.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
I think we've participated in some. We've never caught anything, but we've still gone to, check things out and
Right.
see what there is.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other projects? You mentioned the Vinebrook evaluation. What are some of the other some of the other projects during your tenure that you've looked at with the Conservation Department?
What do you mean by projects?
Or what are some, like the grant, what are some of the other things that you do every day?
Oh, okay. So the Conservation Department basically has two primary functions. One is to manage the land,
Okay,
and the other is basically as regulators.
okay,
Because there's so much construction and whatnot, the regulation is basically what we spend most of our time doing.
okay,
And that's what the Conservation Commission almost entirely does.
okay,
We have other things we do in the summertime. We have seasonal workers who do stream cleaning.
okay.
Um,
Now, is that like in those watershed areas or?
They're in the rivers themselves, except
Oh,
for Vinebrook, which
okay.
is too deep and too dangerous. But yeah, that's a program that started before I got here, so it's been
Okay.
going on. Let's see, so I did it in 1994. So it's been going on for
That's how
probably
you started in
30
Burlington.
years,
Wow.
I would imagine.
Okay.
But
And we still haven't learned to pick up all of our trash.
no, that's part of what they do, and they go out and pick up other people's trash lots of times. But it's also like, removing debris from the streams that could
Okay.
cause flooding.
Well, I'm also thinking, had an Eagle Scout candidate a few episodes ago, and he worked at creating a trail over by Vinebrook.
Yeah,
And I think he said when he was cleaning out the trail, he found a couch on the trail. How often and I remember, I think it's over by Sawmill, people leave tires and cars, and
right.
how does that play a role in everything?
I mean, it's pretty disappointing.
Can they clean out? I mean, how do you take a tire off of a trail?
Yeah, I mean, tires have historically been one of the things that we've had a lot of. DPW in the summertime gives us a place to put all the tires that we get because I think they get to recycle them. But yeah, it's pretty disappointing. There was a time like maybe 4 or 5 years ago where we found a couch way out in the middle of a conservation area. How they got it there, I have no idea. I mean, I had my guys drive a pickup truck, and they got maybe within a few hundred feet of it, and they then had to carry it to the truck. But whoever brought it there didn't even have the benefit of driving as close as we did. How?
Yeah.
I mean,
How do you get it out there?
I
Why
don't-
would you put it out?
yeah. I mean, I don't know, but yeah. I mean, there's a lot of picking up stuff like that. It's kind of disappointing, but it just comes with the territory. And it's probably never going to end. You always have to pick up people who.
Right. Now with the stream cleanup, I remember, when I was really little, we used to find like little frogs and tadpoles. I mean, how is wildlife impacted when you do that? Is it to bring wildlife back? Is it to protect the groundwater?
Right. So
what are the goals?
we try to do the stream cleaning in as environmentally friendly way as possible. So we're removing woody debris from the streams, and there's pluses and minuses to that. There's a lot of wildlife, turtles and whatnot, who would benefit from having that debris. So I try to hire people who are like studying environmental studies and that sort of thing to work in the summertime. Not always successful, but that's always my goal, to get people who are really interested. Because we're walking a fine line. We want to remove stuff that's going to block the stream and cause people's yards to flood.
I was thinking it was like, okay, keep going.
But we don't want to go in and remove everything, because then it basically turns the stream into something that's wildlife unfriendly.
Okay. Because I was thinking, the stream cleanup would just be getting rid of, the tires, the litter and everything, but you're actually like clearing out like leaves and branches and fallen trees?
Sometimes.
Stuff like that?
Sometimes.
Okay.
If it looks like it's going to block the stream enough to cause flooding. Because we're doing this primarily in residential areas. I mean, these are streams that are going through people's backyards. And the whole genesis of the program was people were concerned about flooding. And one of the town's responses was to start doing this hand stream cleaning.
Okay.
And it definitely helps. I mean, all it takes is like a couple of pieces of plywood stuck, along with a tire or something to block the stream
really
and
mess
flood
up the
somebody's
system.
backyard. Yeah.
Okay. What would you, looking forward or moving forward, what would you like to see the town of Burlington do to make your job easier longer term? Whether it's from a residential perspective or what the businesses could do.
I really can't think of anything. Seriously, I mean,
I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, Burlington, in my experience, has been very supportive of conservation. It's a great community in that respect. Anytime we've sought anything, if we've gone to town meeting to try to purchase land, which unfortunately has been rare because there's so little land. But I mean, we've had no problems. The town's very supportive. So off the top of my head, I really can't think of anything. I got no complaints at all. So.
Another total tangent, because we still have about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
So, you've mastered all of my questions. Trash, recycling, even composting. Does that play any role in the environment in town or the need for conservation? Because the reason why, one of the reasons why I'm asking is the landfill out in Western Mass where my parents live is getting too full. So they're telling people you can't use, what are our tote size? 40 gallons? 35 gallons? Whatever the size is. You can't use those anymore. You're dropping down to a 10 gallon.
Right.
And no more bulk pickups, and because we have no room to put it.
Yeah.
Do you see that happening in Burlington at all?
I don't know. So Burlington, I think, does a good job of doing the curbside pickup of all the yard waste. I mean, I'm always kind of amazed that more people don't do backyard composting. Okay. I mean, I've composted my entire adult life. Under my desk, I have a little Tupperware container where I put all my tea bags and coffee grounds and banana peels, and I take them home once a week and throw them in my compost bucket, my compost bin at home. One of the 3 compost. Actually, we have 4 now.
Okay.
And it's so easy to do. And if you garden, or even if you don't garden, your neighbors probably would be happy to take some compost. It's great for the garden.
Okay.
So, and that's one way certainly to keep stuff out of the waste stream.
Now, if you didn't have a garden and you composted and you have all this amazing soil, could you just spread it out and
You can put it around your trees, your bushes.
Okay.
It's great mulch to put around anything. Everybody's got like a flower bed or something. You don't have to have an enormous vegetable garden, but if you
Okay.
do, that stuff is gold for your vegetable garden. But put it around your rose bushes or around your maple
How long
tree.
does it take generally to go from a banana peel to?
So it depends upon how hardcore you are about it. I don't get in there and turn it like some people
Okay.
turn it all the time, and that'll speed it up.
Okay.
But I've got
I've
four.
seen,
I
like,
have four of them.
big
So
drums.
by the time the fourth one's full, the first
back to
one
the
is
first
like
one.
50% earthworms. It's just like it's amazing that the earthworms just fill that thing. Take over.
Kind of makes you wonder how the worms get in. No, I don't want to know.
Oh, there's openings on the bottom, so that they come right up out of the
Okay.
ground. Yeah. Yeah, composting, it's kind of fun. I'm sort of obsessed with it. I'm sure not too many people bring home their garbage from work.
You never know. But a lot of times I've heard that it's kind of expensive to compost.
I don't find that. It's funny. There's communities, and I don't know if there's people in Burlington.
I think Burlington
I've seen
has
people
started
people
with like the little tiny
Yeah.
totes.
Yeah, and they actually pay for a service to come and pick up their compostables. There's companies that do that.
Yeah.
And then there's actually some cities and towns that provide it. I know Beverly, I think, has
I
you
think so.
put out your compost bucket. But if you live in a suburban place like Burlington, where you've got a sizable yard of your own,
Okay.
I don't know.
It could be free.
Yeah, and if you get a proper composter with a lid, it doesn't smell. There's really no downside to it at all, and you get free good stuff to put on your vegetables
There you go.
or your flowers or whatever.
Okay.
It's a
Well,
no lose situation.
it's a win-win. I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah.
We do still have a couple of minutes left, but let's go back to the administrative side of things.
Okay.
With the department, we have the department, but you also have the Conservation Commission. And people have to be appointed. Is it a certain appointment, or do they just stay on for as long as they want? And who appoints them?
Okay, so they're appointed by the town administrator.
Okay.
Each term's 3 years.
Okay.
Burlington has been very lucky. There are currently 3 conservation commissioners who are on the commission, who were there when I arrived 20 years ago. There was another one who just retired.
Okay.
Carrie Melanson, retired 3 years ago. She had been on the commission since before I got here. The chair, Larry Cohen, is over 30 years now.
Okay.
Gail Lima, who's actually leaving, has been on over 20. Indra Deb has been over 20. So some great institutional knowledge there. We have other members who Bill Boyvin's now been on the board for quite a few years. So we've been lucky to have people who have been on there a long time. But each term is 3 years.
Okay.
But
They can be reappointed for as long as they
right,
want.
there's no term limits or anything like that,
Okay.
thankfully, because there is a learning curve. I think that the newest people maybe get a little intimidated by the level of technical stuff that you have to learn. It takes a while. It really does.
Okay. Now, for the department or conservation in general in a town, are there licenses that you personally need to maintain in order to work on the environment? Is there state regulations that you need to, teachers have to do
Yeah.
continuing education for themselves?
Right.
Is there something that you need to
There's
do?
nothing formal like that. We're constantly taking courses either through something like the Association of Mass Wetland Scientists,
Okay.
there's actually something for conservation commissioners themselves
Oh, okay.
called the Mass Association of Conservation Commissions that has workshops all the time to help the conservation commissioners,
Okay.
learn basically everything about being a conservation commissioner, which is very helpful. But there's no licensing or anything like that. It's all just sort of, you have to do what you have to do. I mean, there's a
Okay.
lot of regulations you have to memorize or certainly know where to find stuff.
Okay.
But there's a lot of training available for the conservation commissioners.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I'm saying you really want to know what you're doing because, right now it may seem like a good idea, but sometimes, the long-term effects could be less than ideal.
Yeah, and that's a big reason why we have our meetings with our peers from other towns. It's and with the Mass Department of Environmental Protection, we have meetings with them as well, and basically, it's very educational.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any other closing thoughts? Because we are getting close to being out of
No,
time.
this has been great. Really appreciate the chance to talk to everybody about conservation and the environment.
Love it.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you very much for tuning in, for coming. I'm getting to the tuning in part, but it was very nice meeting you, very nice chatting with you, and I've learned so much
Great.
about the environment. So
Excellent.
thank you. And I also want to thank everyone at home for tuning in this evening. I hope you are now motivated to pay a little more attention to water tables and the environment and composting and wetlands and everything you need to know about building. So thank you very much for tuning in. Have a great night, and I'll see you around town. Good night.